The Cold War was a sustained state of political and military tension between powers in the Western Bloc, more specifically the United States with NATO and others, and powers in the Eastern Bloc, more specifically the Soviet Union and its allies in the Warsaw Pact. Historians have not fully agreed on the date, but 1947 to 1991 is commonly agreed upon. It was cold because there was no large scale fighting directly between the two sides, although there were major regional wars in Korea, Vietnam, parts of Africa, and South America, as well as Afghanistan, that the two sides supported. The Cold War split the temporary wartime alliance against Nazi Germany, leaving the USSR and the US as two superpowers with profound economic and political differences over totalitarian communism and capitalist democracy. The two superpowers never engaged directly in full-scale armed combat, but they each served heavily in preparation of an all-out nuclear World War III. Alfredo Soto was born in 1937 in Bogota, Colombia, and lived through the entire Cold War. During the time of his birth, the world was dealing with an ideological struggle between communism and capitalism, and Colombia, with its colonial legacy of poor land distribution, a veritable oligarchy, an impoverished mestizo, and indigenous underclasses, was ripe for the rise of Marxist guerrilla opposition. Mr. Soto went to school in Bogota until his third year in college, when he moved to the United States to attend the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. Did you learn about the USSR or communism in school in Colombia, or did you only hear about that when you moved to the US?
We heard about that since I was a child because Our Lady of Fatima appeared asking to all the world to pray for the conversion of Russia. So my mother and all the family prayed the rosary for so that the Russians would be converted and the Soviet Union would stop menacing the world.
As a child in Colombia, Alfredo was taught about the USSR and the threat of communism. Children like Alfredo were told to pray, asking for the conversion of the Soviet Union. Like many South American countries, Colombia has a large Catholic presence, and so Alfredo was raised with strong Catholic traditions. Alfredo first moved to the U.S. to attend college in Illinois and received a degree in civil engineering. It was his first time outside of Colombia, and many aspects of American life were new to him. Around that time, the U.S. was involved in a conflict over the rise of communism in Cuba and was attempting to remove Fidel Castro from leadership. And once you moved to college in the U.S. after Columbia, what did you start hearing about the Soviet Union and the threats of communism?
In those days, the most important case being discussed at the universities in the US was the Cuba situation with Fidel Castro. So the communism was the presence of the communism in our continent, in Cuba, so close to the US, was much more important than the Soviet Union itself, although, of course, Cuba existed because of the Soviet Union and the danger that it would attack the US from Cuban bases.
When Alfredo Soto was in college, a force of 1,400 Cuban exiles, hired and trained by the CIA, failed in an attempt to cause an overthrow of Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro, the longest living communist leader in history, and the former dictator of Cuba, successfully defended Cuba in what is now known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. This gave the Soviet Union a strong foothold in Latin America, as Fidel Castro became an important ally. Given the strong Catholic upbringing that Alfredo and many other children experienced in Colombia and South America, it is natural that communism, which teaches the negative aspects of religion, would be greatly feared. Therefore, a strong tie in his culture existed between the threat of communism and religion. The events at Fatima are an example of this tie between religion and dislike of communism.
Now, as for Fatima, you see, Fatima appeared in Portugal when there was a drive in Portugal to become a communist country, and soon after the Soviet Revolution, when the war of 1914, the First World War, Our Lady appeared in 1918, May 13th. She had six apparitions to three shepherds in Portugal. And the Soviet Union was starting to be created. Marx and Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin were already in the world scene. and while the war was going on. And the Virgin Mary warned that there would be another war even worse than the first one, and that the hope for Christianity was to pray the rosary and go to Mass and really pray for the conversion of Russia. So in the schools where we were in Colombia, which were Catholic schools, we all prayed for the conversion of Russia. So to us, of all nations on earth, the only one that was mentioned daily to pray for was Russia.
After World War II, communism expanded despite Catholic prayers, and it came to a critical junction on October of 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. At this point in time, the U.S. secretly discovered Soviet missile silos being built in Cuba.
I was already in Europe when the Cuban Missile Crisis took place. I went from the US, I went to study in the Netherlands, and I was there when the missile crisis took place.
And what was it like to be in the Netherlands during that?
Well, it was more aware of the situation because, of course, Russia was closer, and Berlin was surrounded, was part of was free but surrounded all around by East Germany, which was part of the Soviet Union.
The Cuban Missile Crisis intensified when the U.S. blockaded Cuba with its navy. However, due to the fear of nuclear war, secret deals were held between the U.S. and the Soviet Union in which the Soviet Union agreed to dismantle the missile silos, while the U.S. agreed to abstain from militarily re-entering Cuba and to remove nuclear missiles from Turkey. Due to economic forces that negatively impacted the communist tendencies of the Soviet Union began to collapse despite its military strength.
We met, for instance, with a German lady who had traveled on the Trans-Siberian Railroad from Vladivostok to Moscow. And she, because your grandmother speaks German fluently, they became friends, and she knew all these Russian restaurants in Moscow. So she would take us to the restaurants pretending to be Russians. And we paid about 1/10 of what we would have paid as a foreigner for the same food in another restaurant. So we had a lot of fun. Actually, it was funny, you know. I went to a restaurant and requested a reservation. If they had a reservation for Mr. Sotovsky, and of course, since they didn't keep records and the records were miserable, they spent hours looking for Mr. Sotovsky in their records, while my wife and I and the other friend were already ordering food inside. So I told them, "Oh, forget about it. I just come in," and they said, "Okay, go ahead." And that way we learned to go into the Russian restaurants, and I never felt that anybody was following me. They might have been, but this was the times when the Russian system, the Soviet Union, was starting to collapse. So I don't think they had that much importance in these things.
Until the collapse of the Soviet Union, the understanding that Soviets had of the West was poor and misguided due to Soviet propaganda and communist control of the media.
Well, a lot of misery. There was the emptiness of deception. I remember quite clearly one of the fellows in nomenclatura, a very high leader of the Soviet Union, telling me, "Can you imagine, Mr. Soto, we have lost 67 years. We have been cheated out of my life 67 years with a vision of America and of the world that didn't exist, and a vision of the Soviet Union that was fake. And now I don't even have anything left. I don't have savings. I don't have anything for me or my family, and I don't have the skills to compete again." This was a fellow in the 60s, 60 years old or so. For them, it was catastrophic.
As the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, oligarchs took control of major Russian corporations while the overall economy continued to suffer. As a result, Russia required assistance through the World Bank with reconstruction projects, after it joined the bank in 1992. At that point, Alfredo had been working for the World Bank since 1970 and oversaw projects in Africa, South America, and India. He joined the Russian project in 1991 as it was beginning to take shape.
They came to me and said, but this is Disney. This is Hollywood. We know that Hollywood invents these things, but a country cannot be run in a way like that. They refused to believe that there was a real system of an operation like the one we have in our country. So when I brought them here, then I exposed them clearly to what we have in the US, and then they started realizing, wow, what we were told was even more of a lie than we thought it would be.